Hello, welcome to World Civilizations up to 1500. Now, this is session 3 of the second topic of the semester, titled Mesopotamia and Egypt, the First River Civilizations. What we're going to be doing in this session is to continue looking at Egyptian civilization. This is something that we started doing at the end of session 2. We're going to continue covering Egyptian history, looking at the different eras of the Egyptian civilization, the different kingdoms, the old, middle, and new kingdoms, for example, and looking at their social organization, political structure, and of course, their religious worldview. After we cover all of that, then part 3, at the very end of this session, we're going to conclude by looking at a comparative analysis between Mesopotamia and Egypt, just looking at geographical, for example, differences, social organization, their differences as well, and also their religious worldviews as well. They will be compared. Now let's look at our slide, so we can continue looking at the Old Kingdom. As I mentioned at the end of session 2, by 2686 BC, we're going to see now the formation of what is called the Old Kingdom is now very well structured. It has now political institutions that are very well recognized across the land. This is an age called the Golden Age of Egypt because most of the construction work in terms of the pyramids, for example, the Sphinx, one of the main temples and so on, were built during this era. This is the Golden Age that Egyptians remember as this is the time of peace, this is the time of harmony, this is the time when everything was going well, and the pharaohs were, of course, keeping the land productive, in peace and harmony, and so on. This is the period when we see the formation of the institution of the pharaoh. We talked about that. The pharaoh is no longer a king in the ordinary sense as in the past, but they had now acquired by this time a divine status. This is a divine monarchy, in other words. They're considered the heirs, the embodiment, the incarnation of the major gods of the Egyptian religion. Now, the form of government, although it's monarchical, it should be understood that this is a theocracy. This is a government ruled by priests. The pharaoh was considered not only the king, the chief, the decision maker, but he was also considered the highest priest of the religion as well. He was carrying both political functions, meaning he was administering the state, but at the same time, he was also in charge of priestly functions, carrying out rituals and ceremonies in the temples, for example, in the pyramids, and of course conducting teachings as well in the schools and so on. I mentioned that the pharaoh was in charge of maintaining harmony and balance in the realm. And the way that he was accomplishing this is by connecting with the goddess of wisdom, Maat, as she was called, actually, the goddess of wisdom, in order to uphold divine justice, to uphold Maat. This is the main function of the pharaoh, was to uphold divine justice, meaning that all of his decrees, all of his laws were considered to be wise pronouncements, in other words, that intended to maintain balance and harmony in the world. Okay, you can see this is a depiction again of certain murals of ancient Egypt. The pharaoh is sitting, of course, in the throne, and he's facing, of course, the goddess of wisdom. This is his main responsibility. He had to maintain communication with the goddess of wisdom that was in the world, again, lived the goddess of wisdom in the world of the gods. And by having this communication, he was able to impart divine justice. This is the main duty, according to Egyptian, of the Egyptian religion, of the Egyptian political system. This is the main duty of the pharaoh. Now, the royal administration, the way that the political system was structured in ancient Egypt is going to reveal at the same time the way Egyptian society was structured, meaning this is not just the structure of the government and all the levels of government, from the bottom up, but also this is going to reveal the social classes, if you will, of Egyptian society and the way they were ranked in society as well. It was ranked like a pyramid. Egyptian society had a class system, and certain classes stood at the very top, at the very pinnacle, if you will, of the pyramid, of the hierarchy. And of course, there's going to be classes that are going to be subordinate below, all the way to the very bottom of society again. So the social structure and the political structure corresponded on the same levels. So at the very top, at the very pinnacle, of course, of the Egyptian political system and society stood the pharaoh, as I said. The pharaoh was considered a living god. He was not just an ordinary human being. He was really the descendant, the heir of the major gods of the Egyptian pantheon. We're going to, of course, discuss Egyptian religion in just a few moments. The major gods and such. So he stood at the very top of society. He's really holding the society together. He's making the most important decisions in the economy, in the legal world, and so on, in the religion. And his, again, duty was to maintain the society together. Now, below the pharaoh was an individual who was like the second hand of the pharaoh, a type of prime minister, so to speak. Just below the pharaoh was the grand vizier, as he was called. He was really in charge of executing the laws of the pharaoh. In other words, the chief officer in charge of the most important agencies or administrations of the kingdom. So, because the pharaoh was so much involved with priestly functions, he needed to have a chief officer that will be in charge of the administration of the state. So, the Grand Vizier, as he was called, he was in charge of imparting justice, for example. He was considered to be the chief justice, again, of the legal system, the supreme, in other words, judge in this case. He was also in charge of tax collection, in charge of the treasury department, so to speak, collecting taxes and so on. And also he was in charge of the fields of agriculture as well, tending the agricultural fields, making sure that the irrigation systems were functioning properly, the distribution of water and so on. He was attending also, again, those matters, the chief of the fields, as he was called. So he had multiple duties and responsibilities that he was taking care on behalf of the pharaoh. Now, just below the Grand Vizier, we're going to see a series of individuals that also had significant political power and, of course, a very high social standing. And those were the nomarchs. The nomarchs were, once again, the individuals that were overseeing the nomes, those districts that we talked about. There were about 42 districts across Egypt along the banks of the Nile. And before the unification of Egypt, the nomes and the nomarchs were pretty much self-ruled and independent, but now they're subordinated, of course, to the pharaoh, and they're going to govern the people on behalf of the pharaoh. So the nomarchs were, in many cases, referred as the rulers of king's people. Okay, so they were like a mini king, so to speak. They were really the representatives of the pharaoh on a very local level, that is to say. Okay, and they also had significant authority locally, and of course their social standing was much, much greater than the rest of the masses as well. They didn't have the same status, let's say, as the Grand Vizier or the pharaoh, but they were, of course, very well positioned within the hierarchy. Now, just below the nomarchs, there was a class of individuals that are going to really rise above the rest of the masses as well. And they're going to also acquire some significant social status and standing within the political order and also the social system. And those were the scribes. Okay, the scribe was the individual who learned the writing system of ancient Egypt, the hieroglyphs. We're going to be talking about the hieroglyphs, of course, the system of writing. They were the learned people. In other words, they went through the school system. Of course, Egypt did not have a public education system at this point in which the masses were undergoing years and years of training, but there were certain special schools for those that aspired to work within the administration as, let's say, bureaucrats. Those were the state administrators, that is to say, and they're going to be carrying a lot of the functions of the state, like maintaining records, for example, records of taxes, records of legal cases, or historical records of the deeds of the pharaohs, for example, or religious, of course, literature, religious writings and symbols. All of that, again, were functions carried out by the scribes, and they constituted, really, the scribes a class, the scribe class, as they were called. They can be considered like the educated class, in other words, the educated elite. That is to say, they were not so numerous, of course, but they were significant in ancient Egypt due to the fact that they were needed, and from time to time, people were at the very bottom of society, particularly the merchants, and the sons of the merchants were actually incentivized to actually attend the schools so they can become a scribe and work for the state. This was a very, very good opportunity for the lower strata of society, the farmers, the artisans, and the merchants, to actually move upward within the hierarchy, due to the fact that Egyptian society, as most societies around the world, were very rigid. In other words, those were very rigid social hierarchies in which people could not really move outside of their class. If people were born as a farmer or a merchant or an artisan, they could not really move upward in the ladder, in the social ladder. There was not a lot of social mobility in the ancient world. The only opportunity to move upward, so to speak, and pretty much join the administration of the state was to become a scribe. This was a ticket, if you will, to move upward. So it provided a link, in other words, for the masses below to the administrators above. Okay, so the scribes had also some status in society. There were people, again, scribes that actually lived in the temples, almost on a permanent basis, other in the royal courts, and they were, in many cases, tax exempt. They were not to pay tribute, just because their labor was a form of tribute, and they were serving the state on a permanent basis, and that was considered quite enough, in other words. So they had certain privileges, in other words, not paying taxes in this case. All right. So just below the scribe class, as it was called, were, of course, the rest of the masses, the rest of society. The bulk, the vast majority of the Egyptian population were farmers. Over 90%, again, of the Egyptian population were farmers. A small minority were artisans. They were the people that were actually crafting, of course, artwork. They were the ones crafting religious icons, for example. They were the ones working with metals, with gold, with bronze, and so on. And there were the merchants. The merchants were the ones that actually, of course, engaged in trade, whether it was long distance trade, or they were in charge of the marketplace, again, within each community in Egyptian civilization. They also had some social standing, and like I said, more often than not, it was really the sons of the merchants who ended up moving upward in the ladder to the scribe class, in this time that we're talking about. Now, what is very important to note as well is that this royal administration and the entire social structure of Egyptian civilization was maintained through a system of tribute. What kept society together? What made the state function? What made the economy function? Was that everything worked around this tribute system. In other words, that people during this time needed to pay tribute to their overlords, whether they're paying tribute to the nomarchs, to the Grand Vizier, to the Pharaoh, in order to keep the civilization going. They needed to pay tribute in form of labor, for example. They needed to work for the Pharaoh, for their overlords. They needed to actually share a certain percentage of their crops and animals that they raised and so on to their overlords in order to keep the society going. Now, the difference, of course, between this kind of tribute system that we see here in Egypt and the kind of tribute system we see elsewhere, let's say in Mesopotamia and in other civilizations that we're going to get to look at, is that here people are not paying tribute for the purpose of receiving protection from their overlords, like in Mesopotamia. We talked about that. In Mesopotamia, very clearly, people were moving into the cities in search for protection. They were willing to pay tribute to a king, a strong man, to be protected. Here, the idea is quite different. People were paying tribute to their pharaohs and such, not to receive necessarily protection, but more so to maintain balance and harmony in the world. They believed that the world they inhabited was rather benevolent, it was very productive, it was a blessing, and in order to keep this world and to keep it going, they needed to actually serve their gods. Okay? So they believed that they needed to actually work and labor to serve their gods, the gods of creation that maintain the stability of the world. And one way to do this was to serve the representatives of the gods on earth. And of course, the representatives of God on earth, of course, was the Pharaoh in this case, that they were actually serving a God, a living God, for the living God to maintain this balance and harmony, in other words. So all the work that they performed, whether it was growing crops or tending animals to provide a share of those products, or the labor they provided by building the temples and the cities and the pyramids and so on, was a tribute paid to the gods in this case. So this is a very different kind of concept. Not all tribute that was paid in the ancient world was done for the same purpose. Each civilization had a whole different meaning as to why people are coming together to create a civilization. Now, I mentioned the scribe class. The scribes were schooled for about 10 years. All the scribes needed to go to school for about 10 years in order to learn the writing system. And this is exactly what the scribes had to learn in that school for 10 years. It was a system of writing that the ancient Egyptians formulated in order to accumulate knowledge and pass it down to future generations. It was very important to take notes, to write down everything they knew, all their discoveries, all their ideas, their mythologies, for example, and their histories as well, the way they conceptualize history. Of course, history and mythology were indistinguishable during this time. But nonetheless, civilizations all over the world produced their own type of writing system. We mentioned, of course, the Mesopotamian writing system, the cuneiform, as it was called, on those bases and so on, the cylinders and so on, the clay tablets. Here, we see a similar, but also very different kind of writing system known as the hieroglyphs, as they were called, this picture writing. People are going to, in ancient Egypt, create certain symbols to convey a certain idea or concept, in other words. Okay, so this is not an alphabet. We're not really looking at symbols representing letters necessarily, but they're representing words, they're representing ideas or concepts. Okay, and so they're going to create this initially out of necessity, and the necessity was to keep records of the cycles of the Nile. They started observing that the Nile, undergoes natural patterns, natural cycles on a yearly basis, and they started really writing down the cycles of the floodings of the Nile. When the Nile begins to flood, for example, well, that's around June. All right, so they started really taking notes about, you know, the specific time of the year when this was happening, and then how many months again the Nile produced abundant water, for example. All right, so they started actually counting the days, and of course the recession of the Nile gradually around October, November, the Nile started receding. They started taking notes, and then there will be another cycle around January, February again, that where the Nile begins to dry up. Okay, it was a period of drought, in other words. Okay, and it's really, kind of like the Nile is just losing all of its body of water altogether. So they needed to keep those records. And so the way to do that was to develop a writing system, and this is why the hieroglyphs, again, were created. Now, of course, there were other purposes for creating the hieroglyphs, and that is that the ancient Egyptians also paid attention to the cycle of the sun. The cycle of the sun was deeply connected with the cycle of agriculture, with the cycle of the Nile as well. So they wanted to have a very precise calendar, a solar calendar, that is to say, that will count the days for the entire solar year. So they also used the hieroglyphs for that purpose as well, in order to have a greater and more in-depth understanding of the agricultural cycle, the planting cycle, the blossoming of the crops, harvest, for example, and rest, winter, and so on, to time the celebrations that were conducted in each of those cycles of agriculture as well. Now, at the same time, the hieroglyphs were also used to keep records, royal and state records, meaning that the records of the royal dynasties, of all the pharaohs and the families, in other words, data, precise data of all the family members of the dynasty and who was really the heir of the throne whenever a pharaoh will die, the succession, for example, all of that was recorded to keep records, in other words, for legitimacy purposes. Pharaohs and their families wanted to legitimize their authority. They wanted to make sure that the future generations understood why their heirs were going to continue in power. So they wanted to make a direct connection between them and their former, of course, ancestors, their pharaohs that came before them, and also for their future generations as well. They also keeping records of the activities of the pharaohs, the activities of the state, their constructions, when they built temples, for example, when they initiated certain ceremonies that were important in marking the beginning, for example, of a new religious pilgrimage or ceremony, in their realm, and so on. Their deeds in warfare, and so on. All of that was necessary, again, to keep record of. And this is what the scribes, again, were doing. They were keeping records exactly of the state. They were keeping records of the activities of the pharaohs, their families, their lineage, and their deeds as well. In many cases were considered heroic deeds as well, connecting the pharaohs with the gods that created the world. Now, for the whole lapse of Egyptian civilization, of course, this knowledge was really guarded by the scribe class. They were the ones that understood the symbols and could read them. Those symbols were inscribed, in many places. They were not just inscribed in walls, in temples. They were also inscribed in the tombs of the pharaohs, in the coffins and sarcophagus of the priests and the pharaohs. They were inscribed in pyramids as well, and also on barks of paper known as papyrus. The papyrus, again, was really a bark of paper, and there the scribes will, of course, write down the histories, the mythologies, the legal records, and the like. Tax collection as well. But the masses did not know anything about the hieroglyphs. The Egyptian masses had no clue what those writings actually meant. How to actually go about reading them. You have to undergo the training, in other words. So this knowledge was kept guarded by the scribes and the pharaohs and the priests for a long, long time. And not until the Greeks invaded Egypt in the 300s BC, we're going to see, of course, a Greek invasion launched by Alexander the Great, something we're going to actually cover much later in the semester when we look at the ancient Greeks. And when the Greeks invaded Egypt and conquered it, the new rulers, the Greek rulers, came to learn, of course, about the hieroglyphs, and they were the only ones, presumably the only civilization from the outside that invaded Egypt that came to know in very great depth about how to actually read the hieroglyphs, okay? Because this was a guarded knowledge. But after the Greeks fell, the Greeks at some point, after centuries of governing Egypt, there will be ousted, of course, by the Romans. We're going to be talking about that much, much later. After that period, when the Greeks finally were ousted from Egypt, the knowledge of the hieroglyphs was actually lost in time. There was no knowledge, no memory about the hieroglyphs and what they actually meant. Of course, there will be peoples that will rule Egypt. There will be invaders. There will be other groups, outsiders and foreigners that invaded the land and ruled it, and so on, but they had absolutely no idea what the hieroglyphs actually meant or said. Okay, so for centuries and many, many centuries, again, there was really no knowledge about the Egyptian writing system. Not until 1799, we're going to see a dramatic change in this regard when the French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Egypt. He occupied Egypt for a while, and of course there were generals and scientists that came along with him from France, and as they were conducting expeditions in Egypt, they discovered a stone that contained the secret to decode the Egyptian writing system. This code is actually a stone that is called now the Rosetta Stone. Again, it was really discovered in 1799, and the Rosetta Stone actually contains 3 different writing systems. At the very top of the Rosetta Stones is the Egyptian hieroglyphs. You see a number of different Egyptian signs, and those are the Egyptian hieroglyphs. Just beneath the Egyptian hieroglyphs, we're going to see another level of writing, and that is the translation of the Egyptian hieroglyphs into another kind of writing system that the Egyptians developed much, much later. And it was a writing system based on letters. That is to say, they also developed a system of letters much later that was another level, another layer, again, of interpretation and translation for the original Egyptian hieroglyphs. And just beneath the Egyptian letters and that translation, we're going to see everything being translated into the ancient Greek. So what this means is that this stone was actually produced by the Greeks that actually invaded and ruled Egypt after Alexander the Great in the 300s BC. This was actually conducted by the Greeks who ruled Egypt, and the knowledge of the scribes was passed on to them, and they were able to create, of course, a text that will provide the 3 different writing systems: the ancient writing systems of Egypt, the hieroglyphs, and then the letter-based language, and of course the Greek language, of course. And just by knowing ancient Greek, one is able to decode the hieroglyphs. Okay, so the ancient Greek language is going to serve as a link, as a bridge to decode those symbols. And after 1799, of course, the gates were now wide open for a huge body of knowledge and translation to pour into Egyptian history books. Now Egyptologists, those that study Egyptian history, are able to know what those hieroglyphs actually mean whenever they see, for example, symbols on murals and tombs and sarcophagus. Now it is clear what they say because of the Rosetta Stone. All right. Now let's look now at the Egyptian religious worldview. This is, again, the time when Egypt is now forming a view of the world that is going to reveal not only how the Egyptians looked at the world around them and, of course, their place in it, as we'll see. This religious worldview is also going to tell us how the Egyptians conceptualized the political order, the political system, why they believed the political system was just and justifiable and legitimate, for example, and also their ideas about the cycles of life and in agriculture as well, more practical matters. So let's look at the Egyptian religious worldview. Once again, this is going to provide a very, very good insight into the kind of society, political system, and also economic system that the Egyptians inhabited. The Egyptian religious worldview can be described as a very optimistic kind of worldview, as opposed to the Mesopotamian worldview that was more pessimistic. In other words, in Mesopotamia, people really had this conception of life, that life is about just survival and very uncertain. Nature is very violent and capricious. But here is quite the opposite. People are more optimistic because the environment is more gracious. It has predictable rhythms. You can actually chart the rhythms. You can create calendars. Nature doesn't appear to be violent and capricious. So the Egyptians are going to create a worldview in which the major gods and goddesses of creation are actually benevolent. They're actually good, as we'll see. Okay? And they consider life as a blessing as well. Life is a blessing, and even the afterlife, if you're, live a very virtuous life, a moral life, you'll end up also in a paradise, which is also another blessing as well. Okay, so this is a very optimistic worldview that is constructed, again, since the Old Kingdom. Now, one way to understand the religious worldview of any civilization, as I mentioned in the past, is to look at their creation myths, their origin stories. This is a perfect opportunity to actually see how people see the universe and their place in it. How everything began, how everything was created, and how it was organized and ordered. Okay, everything is being said in the creation myth or the origin story. So let's look at the origin stories of the ancient Egyptians in order to actually understand that. So there are so many creation myths, of course, in Egyptian religion, in Egyptian mythology, but the most prominent one is one in which the Egyptians believe that in the very beginning, when there was absolutely nothing being created, of course, there was this ocean. Okay, once again, life begins as an infinite, unbounded, timeless, eternal ocean. And that ocean had nothing contained in it. It was considered to be a state of chaos as well. And out of this ocean emerges the very first supreme being that is going to create the universe and is going to create order. That being has been known by many names across Egyptian history. He's been known as Amun or Aten or Ra, okay, at different periods of Egyptian history. And this entity, this supreme being, is nothing other than the sun god. Okay, so this is the chief of all the gods. Is really the sun god. Okay, this is very revealing because sun worship is emerging all over the world during this time. There are sun cults emerging in different parts of the world, and what this reveals is that this is a religious cult innovated by agriculturalists, farmers that are undergoing an agricultural revolution. They're creating agriculture. They're coming to terms with the fact that the sun is really the one in charge of the agricultural cycle. And so their conclusion is, well, since agriculture is what really sustained civilization, is what really sustained the world in general, the heat, the light that the plants require in order to grow and so on. Therefore, this is the origin of all life, period, in general. Life in general, in the cosmos, in the universe. So this is a sun cult, in other words, per excellence, what this original myth reveals. Now, the myth continues looking also at Ra, or Aten, or Amun, as he was called, giving birth to a series of lesser creator gods out of his own tears. What we see is that from his tears, we're going to see the formation of other creator gods that are going to be in charge of the functioning of the universe as well. Some of those gods are going to be Osiris, Isis, and Horus, for example, as we'll see. There will be yet a fourth, of course, being known as Seth. And Seth, as we'll see, is going to be like the bad guy. He's going to be like an evil god. He turned evil eventually. Now, as the story goes, Osiris was sent to the earth in order to create the very first kingdom in the world, and that was the kingdom of Egypt, according to the mythology, of course. He was sent along with Isis, the sister. They were, brother and sister, because both emanated from Ra. In that regard, they're brothers and sisters, but they're also a couple. They're a married couple that they're pretty much ruling the kingdom. They're instituting monarchy. They become the first pharaohs, for example, and everything was peaceful in the world. Osiris was a very noble, benevolent king, and people were happy with his rule and so on. And at this moment, his own brother Seth, he's also the son of Ra, of course, becomes very jealous of Osiris, and he decides to oust him from power, to remove him from power. So he tricks Osiris into moving into a box that he actually made. It was a very beautiful box, and once he was in a box, he actually closed the box and took him away and dumped the box into the Nile River to send them away, in other words. Isis becomes very disconcerted about Osiris, and she's looking for him. She's also a goddess, by the way, and finds Osiris finally and tries to bring him back. Seth, of course, finds out that Osiris is going to come back, and he once again tries to get rid of Osiris by actually now killing Osiris and chopping his body into 14 pieces and scattering the pieces across the world and across the fields, of the world, And so at this point, Isis now is on a mission, and her mission is to find all of the pieces of Osiris. So she will put Osiris back together, resurrect him, and reinstall Osiris into the throne once again. And she actually fulfills that mission. She's able to do that because she was a goddess. Through her powers of magic, she had the powers of magic, she had the powers of resurrection, she had the power of the elements and the forces of nature. She was really the embodiment, if you will, of nature in this case. She's able to resurrect Osiris. So they go back together, Osiris and Isis, of course, and they continue ruling, of course, the kingdom. They have an offspring, and that offspring is Horus. Horus, of course, in this case is the sun. Okay? And they're depicted here. They become like a sort of trinity in the Egyptian religion: mother, father, and son. Those are the main gods of the Egyptian pantheon, along with Ra, of course, the sun god. When Horus actually grows up, he learns of what Seth did, and he is now determined to wage war against Seth and kills him. So he's actually raising an army, and Seth and Horus actually go to war. And this becomes like a cosmic battle. The forces of light, represented by Horus, are battling the forces of darkness, Seth, represents wickedness, jealousy, and darkness in this case, and Seth is defeated. Okay, and balance and harmony is actually restored in the world. So Horus becomes, of course, a prominent deity in the Egyptian civilization as well. And those are going to be the prominent gods of Egyptian history, Isis, Osiris, and Horus, the Holy Trinity as they were called. Now, what those myths reveal is not just how the Egyptians conceived or conceptualized the world, they're also helpful in understanding how the ancient Egyptians conceptualized, for example, the political order, the divine kings, for example. That this is really the justification for the pharaoh, because who were the first pharaohs? Well, Osiris and Isis, and then after them it was Horus. So all of the pharaohs, all of the royal dynasties of Egyptian history are descendants of Osiris, Isis, and Horus. In other words, they're divine. They're the embodiment of those deities, and they all go back to the sun god as well. So this provides a very good justification for legitimacy for the pharaohs, the legitimacy of the authority, the rule of the kings, in other words. Now, those myths also reveal the ways the Egyptians also conceptualize agriculture, that in reality for the masses in general, let alone for the pharaohs and the priests, what those myths reveal is that this is the way that nature actually works. The cycle of nature, the cycle of agriculture is just a representation, again, of how we see the forces that actually created the world. Ra, for example, Osiris, Isis, and Horus, for example. Agriculture goes through a cycle every year. Nature as a whole goes through a cycle, and the cycle is life at the beginning of the agricultural year, where the crops grow and blossom, and then we see death, during harvest time, and there's the period of drought, of course, afterwards. That is the death of agriculture. Everything dies, the vegetation dies, and then, of course, the following year, everything is renewed and is born again. So nature is constantly, year after year, through the power of the sun and the power of nature, is going through the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. So Osiris, in many cases, was considered to be the god of vegetation. He's dying every year, only to be resurrected again every year by Isis. And Isis is considered Mother Nature. She is the feminine aspect of divinity. She is Mother Nature. She's the goddess, and through her powers, the powers of magic, she brings vegetation, or Osiris, every year back to life. So again, this is more of an agricultural understanding, if you will, of the mythology, if you will. But there's also a highly spiritual or highly philosophical as well understanding of that mythology, in that what those myths also reveal is that the ancient Egyptians were also conceptualizing the very first ideas of salvation, meaning that the Egyptians believed that we are endowed with a spirit or a soul that survives after death, and that after death our soul, depending on our deeds, whether we lived a virtuous moral life or not, our soul is going to go into an afterlife and actually either be rewarded or be punished. So again, this is also giving rise to a religion of salvation as well. This is one of the very first instances where an ancient civilization is conceptualizing an afterlife in which the soul goes either to be rewarded or to be punished, for eternity. So what is the Egyptian afterlife? Well, according to the ancient Egyptians, again, they do believe in a kind of heaven, if you will, the concept of heaven. Once again, this is a very optimistic religion. And so the ancient Egyptians believe that this paradise, this heaven, is just like the earth. It's very similar. There are fields, there's crops, there's the Nile, etc. But people live very happy. There's abundance of crops, People still have to work, they still have to labor, but there's endless and endless abundance, prosperity. There's no sorrow, there's always happiness and joy. So in a certain sense, they're really projecting their own ideas of the natural environment and their own geography onto the afterlife. This is very, very, very clear. Now, this heaven was considered the field of reeds of endless abundance as well. This is the place of reward. The place of punishment, this is not a hell in which the soul is tormented forever, but rather this is a place of darkness where the soul ceases to exist. It goes into oblivion. It disappears from existence, in other words. Those are the people that actually misbehaved and, mistreated other people and so on, committed transgressions of different sorts and so on. They were really, really, again, bad. They believed that Osiris, the god that actually resurrected, was the one that was actually at the gates of heaven. He was the one actually judging, in other words, the souls, that there was this court, court system in which the soul, as soon as it arrived, Osiris will have a scale and he will place the soul of the deceased person, the heart of the deceased person. The heart will be placed on a scale on one side and a feather on the other. So if the heart weighted more than the feather, then that person will be sent to hell, because that means that the heart was heavy. It was heavy with transgressions, that is to say. If the heart was lighter than the feather, that means that the heart was the heart of a very good, virtuous, moral person that had no transgressions whatsoever. So therefore, the gates of heaven will be open and that person will enjoy paradise. In other words, the field of reeds and so on. So Osiris was considered to be pretty much the supreme judge of the other world, and he was also the god of the underworld, the place of the dead as well. Now, in this regard, mummification was very important to, in their understanding, prepare the journey, the spiritual journey of the soul that departed the body to go into the other world. It is not very clear among scholars what was really the real underlying purpose of mummification. There's conflicting interpretations, there's very different schools of thought and interpretation about what was really the main reason why the pharaohs and really the upper classes of Egyptian society, for example, the administrators, the priests, and so on, including the nomarchs and so on, why they were so preoccupied with preserving the body, to mummifying the body, preserving it inside of a casket or sarcophagus or coffin, so it will not rot and decay. It was not very clear. Several interpretations indicate that, well, they believe that by preserving the body, the soul in the future will be able to actually come back to earth if needed, and they will use the body. So they needed a body, and that had to be preserved for the soul that had departed to actually come back to earth. That's one of the interpretations. Another interpretation is that by mummifying the body and burying the body with jewelry and possessions and food, that they were actually helping the soul make the journey into the place of reeds. So they will have the energy, the nourishment, and so on to move upward in those spiritual worlds and the like. It's not very clear as to what is the real reason why they were actually mummifying the body. The priest had that knowledge, but the rest of the masses, of course, had only just very general ideas, perhaps even superstitious ideas about it. But the priests and the pharaohs had a more occult knowledge of why they were doing this that is not very, very clear to us, in other words. But what is clear is that they believed that they needed to inscribe on the coffin, on the sarcophagus, a series of prayers for the soul that was moving into the other world to use to open the doors of the different spiritual worlds in the journey. So there were many prayers and charms, enchantments, and so on that needed to be said in the other world Together, all of those prayers that were recited during the funerals and inscribed in the coffins are known as the Book of the Dead. Again, this is a very, very important, again, collection of prayers that were inscribed all over the sarcophagus for the souls that were departing and they were moving into the spiritual world to use, in other words. So they will not forget. They will know what to say and when to say them and so on. So they will be moving upward in the spiritual world. It's called the Book of the Dead. Again, it's just, again, magical formulas, enchantments, and so on. Now, Horus will become a major god in Egyptian society. He's considered to be a hero, really a culture hero. He's actually a national god because he's the one that defeated the forces of darkness embodied by Seth. In other words, Seth was really the embodiment of greed and jealousy and darkness. The forces that were trying to destroy not only the pharaohs but also to dismember Egyptian civilization as well. Because when Seth actually killed Osiris and dismembered Osiris, he was not just killing the pharaoh, he was really dismembering the kingdom. He was really shattering Egypt. Overall, he was smashing it to pieces. And of course, Isis had to bring Osiris together symbolically. In other words, the kingdom was restored. In other words, and Horus is the one that actually unified all the forces of Egypt in order to destroy, of course, Seth and attain the unification of Egypt once again. Horus saved Egypt. He's a national god. He is the god of the nation that saved Egyptian civilization against Seth, the forces of darkness. And Seth became now the representation of all the forces that were trying to dismember Egypt. And those forces were coming from abroad. In other words, the foreigners, the nomads, the barbarians, all the empires that are going to be raiding and invading Egypt to destroy it. They're going to become the embodiment of Seth as well. He is the representation of evil and greed. This is a society that was really living in a magical world. The Egyptians really believed in magic. Magic is totally real. If people learn spells, you'll be able to control the forces of nature. You'll be able to produce rain. You'll be able to appeal to the spirits and the gods in order to help you with aspects of health, for example, disease, getting rid of disease and so on, produce more rain and crops and the like. So this was a major preoccupation of the Egyptian religious worldview, magic and spells, and also divination. The idea that people can actually foresee and foretell the future. This is going to be something that is, taking place on an everyday basis. People are reciting formulas and prayers for the hope of actually attaining a vision for the future and the like. Egyptian religion was also considered to be syncretic. Syncretic religion means that this is a religion that was willing and able to absorb beliefs in gods and goddesses from the outside. They had no problem whatsoever in actually absorbing and appropriating foreign gods into their own religious system, because ultimately all of the gods and goddesses of all the religions, from their own perspective, are the spirits and the forces of nature. So if they help, so why not pray to them? Even though they're not part of your own religious upbringing, doesn't matter, because the gods that other people pray to are simply just the gods of nature, and by praying to them, you can increase your chances in the world of attaining something that you really need and want, whether it's good luck, health, and so on, a good marriage, you name it. Success in battle, doesn't matter. Okay, another very important god of the Egyptian pantheon is Thoth. Thoth is considered to be the god of wisdom. In this case, is very different from Maat, the goddess of wisdom. Thoth was supposed to be actually a human being that came to earth and founded all of the schools of wisdom of ancient Egypt. Allegedly, according to Egyptian mythology, he lived 18,000 years before Christ. So again, this is again a mythical figure that founded all of the writing systems according to the mythology. He founded the philosophy, the religion, and so on. And he was one of the major gods worshipped, particularly by the pharaohs, the priests, and the scribe class. Also, the top administrators in this religion followed a book. Now, this is not a religious scripture necessarily. This is a philosophical book. It's a book of wisdom. It was written actually by a grand vizier of an old pharaoh. His name was Ptahhotep. So Ptahhotep, as he was called, was actually a grand vizier or a prime minister who was really wise and left a book of ethics. What is the proper way that top administrators and officials need to behave within the administration and within the society. Proper rules of conduct, morals and ethic, proper behavior, and the like. This is a very ancient book that was written 2880 BC, and this is a book that was guarded and used by also, once again, the pharaohs, the royal dynasties, the grand viziers, and the top administrators. Again, it was part of the religious tradition. Although it's not a religious writing, it is, of course, a very important scripture. Now, the Old Kingdom was also a period of intense construction work, public works, and this is the period where all the pyramids were built. The Old Kingdom, again, this is the time when the pyramids were built. Allegedly, according to Egyptologists, this is something that started about 2650 BC when the pharaoh Sozer and his assistant, he had, of course, a very wise assistant. He was a physician. He was a philosopher. He was a very learned person, very virtuous. Imhotep, he was called. Both initiated this construction revolution, the pyramid revolution in Egypt history, which was also an architectural revolution in world history. Imhotep wanted to build a majestic tomb for the pharaoh Sozer. And so he started building this tomb at Saqqara. Saqqara was a region where the pharaohs were actually buried, like a sort of royal cemetery, in other words. Okay, but he wanted to build a majestic temple in which, instead of just building one mound, in other words, for the tomb, he wanted to build a series of mounds, one on top of the other in a pyramid form. And of course, the pharaoh will be buried inside in the very middle of the pyramid. So this is the very first pyramid ever built, according to Egyptian records. And this began this process of pyramid building in Egyptian history. Again, this is leading to an architectural revolution, in that this is a monument that was not really built from mud. This was a monument built from stones and rocks, in other words. So this was revolutionary for the standards of that time. The pyramids are built at the city, in a place, a site known as Giza, the pyramids of Giza, and they had multiple functions, the pyramids of Giza, in this regard. The major, most majestic, astonishing, of course, monuments of Egyptian civilization. They were religious temples. People were carrying out religious ceremonies in the pyramids, for example, so they were used for that purpose. There were also burial sites. The pharaohs and their top officials, the high priest, were buried inside, of course, the pyramids in sarcophagus. We already mentioned they were mummified and the like. This is another, again, function. Another function is that there were also astronomical markers, meaning that their function was also to mark the beginning and ending of the agricultural year. They were supposed to align in certain moments of the year, whether it was the beginning of the agricultural cycle at the beginning of spring, or the end of the agricultural cycle at the end, of course, of the agricultural year in December 21st. the beginning of winter. They were supposed to align again with the movement of the sun, particularly at sunset. Okay, so this is again an example of how at sunset, for example, during, for example, the winter solstice at the end of the agricultural year, the sun is descending, on the back of the pyramid in the very middle of it. So it's marking really, again, something about the sun. In other words, it's marking the ending of the agricultural year at the beginning of winter. The temple at Karnak, for example, also has very clearly, a marker in which the sun descends at the very middle of the two columns again, and you can see how the astronomer priest, the priests that were actually in charge of the construction work, wanted to make sure that they will mark the end of the agricultural year by having the temples built in this fashion. The Sphinx also is also marking the beginning of the agricultural year. You can see the Sphinx. Behind the Sphinx on the right side, of course, you can see that it's also facing the sun. Again, the back of the Sphinx, of course, is facing the sun and is marking also the beginning of spring. This is very well documented, again, how the Sphinx and the pyramids are also astronomical markers. They're marking the movements of the sun in this case. Now, the cities that are built during this time are ceremonial, meaning that the purpose of the cities are not for people to live there. Here, cities like Memphis or Thebes or Karnak, for example, are not for people to live there the way that in Mesopotamia, people actually live inside those actual cities. Here in Egypt, the cities are exclusively built for ceremonial purposes, to carry out pilgrimages, religious fiestas and ceremonies. The masses attend, of course, the priests carry out the public rituals, and then people go back to their farms. So people live outside the cities. They don't live inside of the cities. So although technically speaking, Egypt is considered a civilization, life in the city, well, people don't actually inhabit the cities. Those are actually, again, used for ceremonial purposes. And the hieroglyphs, of course, inscribed in those cities very clearly tell that, of course. Now, at the end of the Old Kingdom, we're going to see fragmentation. In Egypt, that kingdom starts to kind of collapse due to the fact that the nobles, the nomarchs, the overlords of the nomes, begin to contest power with the king. There's a tension, political tension taking place, and finally Egypt was struck by a plague, and that creates a period of fragmentation and chaos, giving rise to something called the first intermediate period from 2181 to 2041 BC. Egypt had no actual monarchy. Power goes back to the nomes and the nomarchs. This is a period of intense violence and chaos and uncertainty. This is a brief, if you will, interlude between the Old Kingdom, and suddenly, of course, there's going to be a restored kingdom, so to speak, known as the Middle Kingdom from 2040 to 1782 BC. Didn't last that long, just a few centuries, but nonetheless, this is the intermediate, if you will, Middle Kingdom between the old and the new, so to speak. Egypt becomes unified once again. There is a figure that unifies it called Mentuhotep. He's a strong man, if you will, that rises up to the occasion, and he restores order, and he restores once again the monarchy, the institution of the pharaoh. The Middle Kingdom was known as the feudal age because although the pharaoh is supposed to be the supreme lord of the land, now the nomarchs, the feudal lords in each of the localities have acquired significant power, and they're constantly testing their power against the pharaoh. So there is constant tension now, rivalries between the feudal lords of the nomes and the pharaoh. And there's a constant antagonism, if you will. Those regional elites are constantly contesting power, and they also want to attain supreme power. So the pharaohs are constantly watching their backs. They don't trust, again, those local elites, and there's constant, of course, tension taking place. You can see that, of course, in the decline in the agricultural work. The pyramids or the temples that are built do not have the same quality. Now they're made of mud. They can disintegrate rather easily. So again, the golden age of Egypt can see coming to an end now, in the world of architecture. So at the end of the Middle Kingdom, we see fragmentation once again. There's a collapse of the monarchical system, and power goes back to the nomes once again. The nomes are in control of their own districts. This is giving rise to the second intermediate period of Egyptian history. It ends, the Middle Kingdom ends, and of course there's another intermediate period from 1782 to 1570. But now, during this time, Egypt will become so vulnerable to outsiders that we see foreigners now, nomadic invasions, invading Egypt and taking hold of Egypt. There's a mysterious group coming from the Middle East known as the Hyksos. Historians are still trying to decide who were they, where they came from. It is unknown. But this group arrives. They have, of course, superior technology. They have iron, and they're going to actually install themselves as rulers of Egypt for a while. So foreigners actually for a while rule Egypt. And of course, there's going to be a city, the city of Thebes, that is going to rise up to the occasion. And we see leaders from the city leading the resistance against the Hyksos, as they were called. And they're going to actually succeed in expelling the Hyksos and restoring the kingdom once again. So we see the beginning of a new period in Egyptian history called the New Kingdom from 1570 to 1075. Okay, so it lasted for about 5 centuries, more or less, the New Kingdom. The New Kingdom is totally different from the Middle Kingdom and the Old Kingdom, and for the first time, Egypt now becomes an empire. The Egyptians now, because they were invaded by the Hyksos, they realized that the best course of action to maintain the kingdom protected and unified was to build a large army. And instead of just using it for defense purposes, they need to go into the Middle East and expand territorially and try to invade the nomads, the barbarians outside, to keep them in check, and of course to extract tribute from them as well. So again, we see now the rise of a more military culture inside of Egypt. The pharaohs are no longer just conducting priestly activities. They have become warriors now, and they're leading armies into now foreign expeditions, once again into the Eastern Mediterranean. As you can see in this map, there's an expansionist trend in Egyptian history during this time, and they're also expanding southward, and they're also expanding their control over the Nubian region of Central Africa as well. So there's a massive territorial expansion. They're also engaged in overseas, not really overseas, but foreign trade, long distance trade with Mesopotamia. They're bringing foreign goods. They're extracting tribute from the lands that they're conquering in the Eastern Mediterranean. And they're also extracting gold. There's significant amounts, monumental amount of gold in the Nubian section of southern Egypt in Central Africa. And now Egypt becomes incredibly rich, incredibly wealthy, because all of the tribute and gold that is pouring into the coffers and treasury of the pharaohs. Again, so this is an unprecedented time of wealth and prestige, and the pharaohs become so wealthy that they're now building underground tombs. They're no longer building, of course, their burials in the pyramids anymore, because many of those pyramids have been looted by the foreigners and the nomads of the past, and the gold was sacked. Now they want to hide their tombs, and they're building a new site, in other words, to bury their families there with incredible amounts of gold. They're splendid, again, burial sites with so much gold that this reflects, of course, a period of imperialism in Egyptian history. golden coffers, golden sarcophagus, and the like. Again, so the pharaohs, once again, are warriors per excellence. Ramses II, for example, is one of the key figures of this territorial expansionism, and he's very much remembered, of course, by his expeditions. And this is also a period of religious reform. This is a time when in Egypt, a pharaoh by the name of Akhenaten tried to institute a monotheistic religion, the worshipping of a single god, the sun god, as the universal religion of the empire. Because, well, this is now an empire, and if you're incorporating people from many lands, well, you need a state religion. You need a state called to unify all peoples together. So there was an attempt to also institute a single god for everybody to worship, a universal religion. We'll discuss, those aspects more in depth in the third topic, of course, the coming of the universal religions, as they were called. Now, Egypt, of course, after the New Kingdom, after the Age of Empire collapses, and now it becomes vulnerable to foreign occupations. The third intermediate period of Egyptian history after the empire is a period of constant foreign occupations by foreign powers. The Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, launches, of course, campaigns as well against Egypt. The Persian Empire, of course, also launches campaigns against Egypt as well. The Greeks, the Romans, and at some point, even some southern African kingdoms are able to hold on to power in Egypt as well. Again, this is something we're going to look at more closely in the third topic of the semester that follows after this. Now, last but not least, part 3 is going to look rather briefly into a comparative analysis between Mesopotamia and Egypt. This topic has seen two river civilizations that flourished very early on in world history that were so close, geographically speaking, to one another. They're two nearby river civilizations that we might assume that because of their close proximity, that they were kind of similar in so many regards. And although they shared some similarities, they also were so different from one another on so many other levels. So this is very, very important to note how Egypt here in Northeast Africa, along the Nile, and Sumeria here, southern Mesopotamia, were flourishing almost simultaneously side by side. There were some trade connections, although not very significant. But although they were flourishing side by side, they were very, very different from one another. And this is, again, what we're going to actually see here rather quickly, some of their differences and also their similarities. In terms of geography, we can see that, for example, Egypt was insulated geographically by the desert on both sides of the Nile, mountains to the south, and the Mediterranean Ocean to the north. So those barriers helped Egypt for about 3,000 years keep Egyptian civilization going without really a lot of interruptions. Of course, we saw some interruptions. Of course, there were some interruptions, but for long periods of time, Egypt had a long continuity of political order and stability and also social order. They were able to preserve their traditions, their legends, their writing system quite intact for a long, long time. Because again, foreigners could not easily move into Egypt because of those barriers. Mesopotamia, on the other hand, is composed of a geography that has mud flat plains, so that actually makes it quite easier for one city to expand and invade a neighboring city, and this created a lot of instability and tensions and rivalry among all the cities of Mesopotamia. The terrains were far more exposed because there was not a lot of barriers that will stop foreign armies from marching and invading a city, for example. This is very important. So there's more and more rivalry, more tension, more warfare. Society tend to be more warlike again in Mesopotamia than in Egypt. Okay. because of those constant raids and interruptions. The religion. The religion is completely different. In Mesopotamia, we have a more chaotic religion, is more, pessimistic because of the environment. Again, because nature appears to be more violent. There's more violent floodings and so on that are unpredictable and erratic. Whereas in Egypt, nature is more balanced and harmonious. The environment is very predictable, and the rhythms can be timed according to the rhythms of nature and the seasons as well. So the religion is very different. The religion in Mesopotamia is chaotic. The gods are chaotic. And in Egypt, they're more harmonious. They're keeping balance and harmony. You can see, the concept of life, death, and the afterlife, reflected in those two different visions. For the Mesopotamians, life is unpredictable, is all about survival, and really death is pretty much the end of everything, because even though there's an afterlife, people go into this other world and is just bored to death. It's a green, gray world where there's nothing, there's a desert, and people are just eating mud, in other words. In the Egyptian world, again, there's a possibility of salvation. This idea that if you live a virtuous life, a good life, you can actually enjoy a paradise, the field of reeds and so on. That is a place of abundance and joy. There's, again, different religious conceptions that emanate from different experiences of the environment. In both religions, we see the building of ceremonial temples to the gods. The Mesopotamians built the ziggurats. Those were actually replicas of the mountains where the gods resided, and they needed to be appeased. That is the idea, to appease the gods, because they're always angry and capricious. The Egyptians built pyramids to bury their dead and to align those pyramids with the passing of the sun. Again, because those are solar cults that see the sun very orderly, providing life, and they wanted to time the moments of agriculture as well. Although they're similar, the pyramids and the ziggurats, the purpose and the meaning and the use is very different. Both societies, religion is the underpinning of the political system. Both societies are theocracies. They're ruled by priests. The Sumerians in Mesopotamia and the Egyptians, of course, that's the source of the political legitimacy. The pharaohs are considered the embodiment, the living, the embodiment of the gods. They're living gods. In Mesopotamia, the kings of Mesopotamia and Sumeria, they're considered, individuals that are actually placed by the gods in order to maintain order in the world. Again, they also have a divine origin as well. They're priests as well, the highest priests of the religion. Both societies are sun cults. They have sun cults. They are devoted to the sun god because both are actually agricultural civilizations. Both are agricultural civilizations. They worship the sun god. And this is, again, going to be a pattern all over the world, as we'll see later on in the other civilizations. We're going to see the rise of the sun cults due to the fact that, again, those are agricultural societies. Now, within the religion, in each society, women also play a role, although very different role. In Egypt, for example, women are allowed to play a role in the temples because of Isis. In this case, Isis was the first female. She was a goddess. She's the goddess of nature. So in the Egyptian religion, women are allowed to carry out certain functions. They're allowed to become priestess, in other words, of the temples as well. They are the embodiment in many cases of the principles of Isis, working with magic, working with the elements, again, of nature and the like. In Mesopotamia, women are also allowed to participate in the religion, but for a different purpose. They're the concubines of the gods. They're serving the gods, performing, in this case, certain rituals geared for magic. It's more like sexual magic, and they're actually doing this to serve the gods and the representatives of the gods, the priests. In many cases, they're considered to be the temple prostitutes engaged in sexual magical rituals that the priests are carrying out, and the women are serving that purpose, again, in Sumeria. Now, last but not least, the society. Both have, of course, cities, but in Mesopotamia, cities are actually urban centers. This is where people live. They're congregated there by the tens of thousands for the purpose of seeking the protection of a strong man. In Egypt, the cities are not inhabited by people. Those are ceremonial centers. People live outside the cities. They live in the farm. In other words, again, so both have cities, but they're used very differently. In other words, those societies both have very rigid social hierarchies. They're hierarchical. They do have pyramids. They rank people from top to bottom. They have classes very clearly. And it was very difficult to move upward in both societies. The only possibility to move upward, let's say in Mesopotamia, was if you became a priest, or if you became part of the warrior class. Warriors and priests were seen as links for the masses to move upward in the ladder, in other words. Whereas in Egypt, the scribes was that class that was the link between the masses and the upper class. In other words, if you were in Egypt and you wanted to climb up the ladder, the social ladder, was to join the schools and become a scribe, and by doing that, you become, again, part of the administrative class, and you have certain privileges. Both societies are based on tribute, but the difference is that in Mesopotamia, tribute is paid for protection. You pay tribute to your overlords for protection, whereas in Egypt, people pay tribute to serve the gods for devotion. This is seen as, again, a gesture, a service to the gods to keep balance and harmony in the world. Okay, this is all I have for you. This has been, of course, the end of session 3. With this, we have concluded the second topic of the semester. We're moving into the third topic of the semester. We're going to initiate that next. This is all, of course, I have for you. Thank you, and I'll see you in the third topic coming next. Thank you.